Who is the richest person to have ever lived? It sounds like a simple question, one that invites quick answers. In classrooms, boardrooms, and everyday conversations, the responses come almost instantly. Names shaped by modern capitalism dominate the imagination. Industrial magnates, oil tycoons, technology visionaries, men who built fortunes from steel, finance, and code. Names like Rockefeller, Bezos, Musk. These are the figures most people think of when wealth is discussed. Their net worth is tracked in real time. Their influence is visible. Their stories are widely told and retold. But what if every one of those answers is wrong? Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. What if the richest individual in human history lived not in New York, not in Silicon Valley, not in Europe, but in Africa? And not in the modern age, but over 700 years ago. What if this man's wealth was so vast, so overwhelming, that a single journey he made reshaped economies across entire regions? And what if, despite all of this, his name rarely appears in conversations about wealth? This is not speculation. This is history. His name was Mansa Musa. But to understand the man, you must first understand the world that made him possible. Forget the maps you know. Erase the borders, the familiar outlines of continents, and the political divisions that define how we see the world today. Now imagine the 14th century. Europe exists, but it is fragmented, unstable, and far from dominant. Power is uneven. Kingdoms rise and fall with uncertainty. Wealth is limited, and influence is often localized. The Americas remain unknown to the Old World. Asia is vast, powerful, and deeply interconnected through trade and empire. And Africa, often misunderstood in modern narratives, is not a silent or undeveloped land. It is structured, organized, thriving. In West Africa, across expansive savannas and long-distance trade routes, lies an empire that challenges modern assumptions. The Mali Empire. This was not a minor kingdom. It was not a peripheral territory. It was a superpower. At its height, Mali stretched across a vast region larger than Western Europe. It connected deserts to forests, rivers to trade networks, and communities into a unified economic system. But its greatest strength was not visible in its geography. It lay beneath the surface. Gold, not small deposits, not scattered resources, but vast, concentrated reserves. In the medieval world, gold was not simply a symbol of wealth. It was the foundation of economies. It determined the strength of currencies, the stability of trade, and the power of rulers. And Mali controlled a significant portion of the world's known gold supply. Let that settle. While kingdoms elsewhere struggled to accumulate wealth, Mali sat atop it. Caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying gold northward. Trade routes connected West Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Wealth flowed through the empire, shaping not just its own prosperity, but influencing regions far beyond its borders. This was not isolation. This was integration into a global system. And at the center of it all was a ruler who would come to embody that wealth in a way the world had never seen before. But Mansa Musa did not simply inherit riches. He inherited responsibility. Because wealth at that scale is never passive. It demands management. It requires structure. It shapes decisions. And the world he ruled was not simple. It was complex, dynamic, interconnected. To understand Musa, you must understand that he was not just a king sitting on gold. He was a leader operating within a system of trade, governance, and power that required constant attention. The Mali Empire was built on movement. Goods moved across vast distances. Salt from the Sahara, gold from the south. Textiles, ideas, and culture flowing between regions. These exchanges were not random. They were structured, organized through networks that connected cities, merchants, and communities. And at the heart of these networks was trust. Trade depended on it. Governance depended on it. Stability depended on it. Musa inherited a system that functioned, but like all systems, it required leadership to sustain it. And leadership at that level is never just about maintaining what exists. It is about shaping what comes next. But before he would reshape anything, Musa's story would be defined by something unexpected. Not conquest, not expansion, but a question. A question that would change the course of an empire. Before Musa, there was another ruler, a king whose curiosity would alter the direction of history. This king became obsessed with the unknown. He looked westward toward the vast Atlantic Ocean and asked a question few had dared to consider seriously. What lies beyond? Not satisfied with speculation, he acted. He assembled a fleet, hundreds of ships, crewed with men, stocked with supplies, driven by ambition. He sent them into the ocean. Only one ship returned. Its sailors spoke of powerful currents forces, too strong to resist, pulling vessels into the unknown, never to return. Most rulers would have stopped there. But this king did not. He prepared a second expedition. This time he would lead it himself. And he never came back. No ships returned. No message arrived. No trace was found. The ocean swallowed the expedition, and with it, the king. The throne was left behind. And into that vacuum stepped a man named Musa. His rise was not the result of conquest or rebellion. It was the result of absence. He did not take power. He assumed it. And with it came everything that defined the Mali Empire, its wealth, its complexity, its potential. Musa inherited more than a crown. He inherited a system, a network of trade routes, economic structures, and political relationships that required not just maintenance, but mastery. And unlike many rulers who simply preserve what they inherit, Musa would go on to transform it. But that transformation would not begin with policy. It would begin with a decision rooted not in politics, not in economics, but in faith. A decision that would carry him across deserts, through cities, and into the center of the known world. A journey that would introduce him to the world, and introduce the world to him. And in doing so, it would change everything. Power rarely arrives in perfect clarity. More often, it emerges in uncertainty, shaped by absence, defined by circumstance. For Mansa Musa, power did not begin with conquest. It began with inheritance. But not the kind that offers comfort, the kind that demands control. When the previous ruler of Mali vanished into the Atlantic, he left behind more than a vacant throne. He left behind an empire vast, wealthy, and interconnected. An empire whose strength depended not on a single resource, but on the systems that moved it. Musa stepped into that system, and from the beginning it was clear, this was not a kingdom that could be ruled passively. The Mali Empire was built on movement. Caravans crossed the Sahara in long, deliberate lines, carrying goods that connected entire regions. Salt moved south from the desert. Gold moved north from the forests. Textiles, copper, ivory, and ideas flowed between cities. This was not just trade. It was infrastructure, a network of exchange that linked West Africa to North Africa to the Middle East and beyond. Cities like Timbuktu and Gao were not isolated settlements. They were nodes, points of convergence, where goods, people, and knowledge intersected. And at the center of it all was gold. Gold was not simply a resource. It was the engine of the empire. In a world where currency systems were still forming, gold functioned as a universal standard. It was trusted across borders, accepted across cultures, desired across continents. and Mali controlled it. Not a small share, a dominant share. Historians would later estimate that a significant portion of the world's gold supply flowed through the lands Musa governed. This gave Mali leverage, influence, power that extended far beyond its geographic boundaries. But control of resources alone does not sustain an empire. It must be managed, structured, protected, and that responsibility fell to Musa. He governed with intent. He consolidated authority, ensuring that regions within the empire remained aligned. He strengthened administrative systems, reinforcing the structures that supported trade and taxation. Because wealth, at scale, creates risk. It attracts attention. It invites competition. And without order, it collapses. Musa understood this. He was not just a beneficiary of wealth. He was its steward. But the world he governed was not simple. Like much of the medieval world, the Mali Empire operated within systems that reflected the realities of its time. Among them is slavery. This is not a detail that can be ignored. It is part of the historical context. Enslaved individuals were present within the empire. They were captured through conflict, integrated into households, and included within economic systems. But the structure of slavery during Musa's time differed from what would later emerge in the transatlantic slave trade. It was not based on race. It was not designed as a permanent, hereditary identity. It did not carry the same ideological framework that would later justify centuries of systemic oppression. This distinction does not remove the moral weight of the system, but it provides clarity. Musa ruled within the structures of his era, and those structures were complex, because power in any time period exists within context. To understand a ruler is not to separate them from their environment, but to recognize how they operated within it. And in Musa's case, what stands out is not just what he inherited, but what he chose to do next. For years, Musa governed. He maintained stability, strengthened the empire, expanded its influence across trade networks that stretched beyond the Sahara. But something else was shaping his thinking, something less visible: faith. Musa was a Muslim, and in his world, faith was not separate from leadership. It influenced decisions, defined responsibilities, shaped purpose. At the core of Islamic practice is a pilgrimage known as the Hajj, a journey to Mecca, that every Muslim is expected to undertake at least once, if they are able. For most, it is a deeply personal act, a demonstration of devotion, a spiritual obligation. But for a ruler of Musa's stature, it carried additional meaning. Because a king does not travel unnoticed. Every movement becomes visible. Every action becomes symbolic. And Musa understood this. By the early 14th century, the Mali Empire was already known within certain trade circles. Its gold had reached distant markets. Its merchants had interacted with other regions. But it was not fully understood, not fully recognized, not fully acknowledged as the power it truly was. The Hajj presented an opportunity to be seen, not through declarations, not through conquest, but through presence. Because presence at scale can redefine perception, and perception, in turn, shapes power. Musa began to prepare, but preparation, for him, was not ordinary. This would not be a quiet journey. It would not be a small delegation. It would be something else entirely, something that matched the scale of the empire he represented. He assembled a caravan, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, soldiers, attendants, merchants, scholars, people who would travel with him across vast distances, through deserts, into cities that had never witnessed anything like what was about to arrive. And then there was the gold. Because Musa did not travel empty-handed. He carried wealth with him. Not symbolic wealth, not limited reserves, but quantities so large they would challenge comprehension. Camels loaded with gold, each carrying hundreds of pounds, enough to sustain entire regions, enough to alter markets, enough to transform perception. This was not just preparation for a journey. It was preparation for an event, because Musa understood something that many leaders fail to grasp. Power is not only what you have, it is what others believe you have. And belief can be shaped. When Musa set out for Mecca, he was fulfilling a religious obligation. But he was also making a statement, without words, without announcements, without declarations, a statement that would travel ahead of him, alongside him, and long after he had passed. A statement that would reach cities before he did. That would create anticipation, curiosity, expectation. And when he arrived, the world would not just see him, it would feel him. But what Musa could not fully anticipate was what would happen next. Because when wealth moves at that scale, it does not simply impress, it disrupts. When Mansa Musa set out for Mecca, the journey itself was not unusual. Pilgrims had traveled that path for generations, across deserts, through cities, toward a sacred destination. But nothing about Musa's journey was ordinary. From the moment his caravan began to move, it became clear this was something the world had never seen before. It stretched across the desert like a moving horizon. Tens of thousands of people, soldiers maintaining order, attendants managing logistics, merchants, scholars, laborers, each playing a role in a system that had to function across vast and unforgiving terrain. And then there were the camels, nearly 100 of them, each carrying gold, not symbolic quantities, not limited reserves, but hundreds of pounds per animal. Gold in volumes so immense that it stopped feeling like a commodity and began to feel like a force. As the caravan moved north, it passed through regions accustomed to trade, to wealth, to the movement of goods across the Sahara. But this was different. This was not trade. This was scale beyond expectation. Word traveled faster than the caravan itself. Cities heard about it before they saw it. A ruler from West Africa, a king with unimaginable wealth, a procession so vast it could not be easily described. By the time Musa approached Cairo, anticipation had already taken hold. Cairo, in the 14th century, was no ordinary city. It was a center of power, culture, and commerce, a place where merchants, scholars, and rulers converged. A city familiar with wealth, but nothing could have prepared it for what was about to arrive. When Musa entered Cairo, he did not arrive quietly. He arrived as an event, a spectacle, a presence that reshaped the atmosphere of the city itself. People gathered, not out of curiosity alone, but out of disbelief. Because what they were witnessing challenged their understanding of wealth. Musa did not behave like a cautious ruler. He did not protect his gold. He distributed it freely to the poor, to merchants, to officials, to anyone who crossed his path. At first, it was seen as generosity, an act of charity, a demonstration of faith, a ruler fulfilling moral obligations. But generosity, at this scale, does not remain simple. It becomes something else. It becomes intervention. Gold began to flow through Cairo's markets in quantities they had never experienced before. And at first, nothing seemed wrong. People received it, spent it, circulated it. But beneath the surface, something subtle began to shift. There was more gold in circulation than before, more than the system was designed to handle. And slowly, almost invisibly, its value began to change. To understand what happened next, you must understand a principle so simple, it is often overlooked. Value is not inherent. it is constructed. Gold is not valuable simply because it exists. It is valuable because it is scarce, because it is difficult to obtain, because not everyone can have it. Scarcity creates desire, and desire creates value. Remove the scarcity, and the structure begins to weaken. This is what Musa's presence in Cairo triggered. As gold became more available, it became less rare. As it became less rare, its value began to decline. Prices adjusted, markets responded, confidence shifted. What had once been stable began to move. At first, the changes were subtle, difficult to detect, but over time they became undeniable. Gold lost value. And when gold loses value, everything connected to it changes. Trade balances shift. Purchasing power fluctuates. Economic stability begins to erode. This was not a temporary fluctuation. It was a disruption. Historians would later record that the economic impact of Musa's visit lasted for years, more than a decade. Think about that. One man, one journey, and economic consequences that extended far beyond his presence. This was not just influence, it was systemic impact. Musa had not set out to disrupt an economy. His actions were rooted in generosity, in faith, in the desire to give. But intention does not always determine outcome. At a certain scale, actions take on a life of their own. They ripple outward. They interact with systems. They create effects that cannot be easily predicted or controlled. This is the paradox of power. What appears as generosity can become disruption. What feels like abundance can create instability. Musa revealed something profound. Wealth at extreme levels does not behave like ordinary wealth. It does not simply accumulate. It transforms the environment around it, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, but always significantly. And yet, the story does not end there. Because at some point, Musa began to recognize what was happening. The shift in value, the changes in the market, the unintended consequences of his actions. And he attempted to respond. According to historical accounts, Musa began to borrow gold back. He took it out of circulation, at high interest rates, an effort to reduce supply, to restore scarcity, to stabilize value. But even this solution carried its own complications, because borrowing introduces new dynamics: debt, obligation, financial pressure. In trying to correct one imbalance, another began to form. This is the nature of complex systems. There are no simple fixes, no perfect reversals. Once change is introduced at scale, it evolves. It interacts with other forces. It creates new conditions. Musa had entered Cairo as a symbol of wealth, but he left behind something more complicated, a lesson, not just about gold, but about power, because what he demonstrated, perhaps unintentionally, is that wealth, at extreme levels, is not neutral. It is active. It shapes systems, influences behavior, alters outcomes in ways that extend far beyond the individual who controls it. This is what makes his story relevant, not just as history, but as insight, because the structures may have changed, but the principle remains. Scale transforms everything, and the question that follows is unavoidable. If wealth at that level can disrupt entire systems, then what should be done with it? Musa would soon begin to answer that question, but not in Cairo. The most important part of his story was still ahead. There are moments in history when something shifts so fundamentally that people do not immediately recognize what has changed. No announcement, no clear turning point, no single event that signals transformation. Just a gradual realization, that the system no longer behaves the way it once did. Mansa Musa's journey through Cairo was one of those moments. At first, it appeared simple. A ruler arrives, a display of wealth, an act of generosity. But beneath that surface, something deeper was unfolding. Because what Musa introduced into Cairo was not just gold. It was volume, scale, and scale changes everything. To understand this, you must move beyond the idea of wealth as something static. We tend to think of wealth as a possession, something that can be held, counted, and transferred. Something that exists independently of its environment. But at a certain level, wealth stops behaving like an object. It becomes a force. And like any force, it interacts with the system around it. It reshapes it, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, but always in ways that cannot be ignored. What Musa revealed, perhaps unintentionally, is that wealth at extreme levels does not simply sit within a system. It alters it. In Cairo, the system was built on balance. Supply and demand, scarcity and value, trust and stability. Gold functioned as a foundation, a reliable measure of wealth that could be used across transactions, across regions, and across time. But that reliability depended on one condition: scarcity. The moment that condition changed, the system began to shift. Musa did not introduce a new currency. He did not change policy. He did not restructure institutions. He simply increased supply. And that was enough. Because when supply increases rapidly, value decreases. This is not theory. It is structure. And once that structure is disrupted, everything connected to it begins to move. Prices adjust. Markets respond. Behavior changes. People begin to act differently. Confidence fluctuates. What was once stable becomes uncertain. This is the ripple effect of scale, and it extends far beyond the initial action. Musa's generosity created immediate benefit. People received gold. They gained purchasing power. For a moment, it seemed like pure advantage. But over time, the consequences emerged. As gold lost value, the purchasing power it represented began to shift. Transactions became less predictable. Markets had to recalibrate. And what began as abundance introduced instability. This is the paradox. More of something valuable does not always create more value. Sometimes it does the opposite. It dilutes it. Musa's experience in Cairo forces a difficult question. Can generosity, when expressed at an extreme scale, produce harm? Not because the intention is flawed, but because the system cannot absorb it. This is not a moral question alone. It is a structural one, and it becomes more relevant as scale increases, because the larger the action, the greater the impact, and the harder it becomes to predict outcomes. Musa did not operate with modern economic models. He did not have data, projections, or simulations, but he observed. He responded. And at some point, he understood that something had shifted. His attempt to borrow gold back into his possession suggests awareness, an effort to correct imbalance, to restore equilibrium. But correction, at that level, is never simple, because systems do not reset. They adapt. When Musa began borrowing gold, he introduced a new variable: debt. And with debt comes obligation, interest, pressure. In trying to solve one problem, another emerged. This is the nature of complex systems. They are interconnected. Change one element, and others respond, not always in predictable ways. This is where Musa's story becomes more than historical. It becomes instructive, because it reveals something about power. At a certain level, power is not about control. It is about influence. The ability to shape outcomes, not directly, but through interaction with systems. Musa did not control Cairo's economy, but he influenced it, significantly. And that influence extended beyond his presence. Long after he left, the effects remained. This is what defines power at scale. It persists. It continues to operate even in absence. Now shift perspective. Move from the 14th century to the present. Today, we live in a world where individuals and institutions control vast amounts of wealth. Decisions are made that move markets. Investments shift industries. Actions ripple through economies. And often, these actions are interpreted through a moral lens. Generous or not. Responsible or not. But Musa's story suggests that there is another layer. A structural layer, where the question is not just whether an action is good or bad, but what it does to the system, because even well-intentioned actions can produce unintended consequences, especially at scale. This does not mean action should be avoided. It means it should be understood, because scale amplifies everything. Impact, risk, consequence. Musa's journey through Cairo represents a turning point, not just in his story, but in his understanding, because what followed would be different. He would shift from immediate distribution to long-term design, from giving resources to building systems. And that distinction matters because distribution addresses the present, but design shapes the future. Musa had seen what wealth could do when released without structure. Now he would begin to explore what it could do when directed with intention. And that shift would define his legacy. Because the most important part of his story was not what he gave away, it was what he built. When Mansa Musa returned from his journey, the world expected a continuation of what it had already witnessed. More wealth, more expansion, more dominance, because history had established a pattern. When rulers accumulate immense wealth, they tend to follow a predictable path. They consolidate power, expand territory, build monuments to their own authority. They turn outward. But Musa did something different. He turned inward. This was not a retreat. It was a recalibration. Because somewhere between the deserts of the Sahara and the cities of North Africa, Musa had seen something that reshaped his understanding of power. He had encountered more than wealth. He had encountered ideas. Cities filled not just with gold, but with knowledge. Institutions that preserved thought across generations. Scholars whose influence extended beyond borders and beyond time. And he understood something subtle but transformative. Gold can command attention, but knowledge commands time. Attention is immediate. It draws focus, creates presence, and generates reaction. But it fades. Time is different. Time sustains. Time preserves. Time carries ideas forward long after the source is gone. When Musa returned to Mali, he did not come back alone. He brought people with him. Scholars, architects, thinkers from regions already established as centers of intellectual tradition. This was not an act of curiosity. It was strategy. Because Musa was about to shift the foundation of his empire from resource-based power to knowledge-based influence. And to do that, he needed more than wealth. He needed structure. He needed systems. He needed a place where ideas could take root and expand. That place would be Timbuktu. Before Musa, Timbuktu existed. It was a trading post. Important, yes, but not yet extraordinary. It functioned as a point of exchange, a location where goods moved, where merchants passed through, and where trade routes converged. But Musa saw something more. He saw potential. And he invested in it. Not randomly, not impulsively, but with precision. Mosques were constructed not only as places of worship, but also as centers of intellectual activity. Spaces where scholars could gather, teach, debate, and exchange ideas. Among these structures was the Jengariber Mosquian, architectural landmark that would stand for centuries. But the buildings were only the beginning, because Musa was not building a city. He was building an ecosystem, an environment where knowledge could circulate, where learning was not confined to a single institution, but embedded within the culture itself. Schools began to emerge, not isolated facilities, but interconnected systems. Students studied under scholars. Scholars produced manuscripts. Manuscripts circulated, were copied, debated, and expanded. Learning was not static. It moved, it evolved. And as it did, something began to change. Timbuktu started to attract people, not just traders, but thinkers, from across West Africa, from North Africa, from regions beyond the immediate reach of Mali. They did not come for gold. They came for knowledge. This is the moment where transformation becomes visible. Because when people travel for ideas rather than resources, the nature of value shifts. And in Timbuktu, value did shift. In most of the medieval world, wealth was measured in tangible assets. Gold, land, goods. But in Timbuktu, another metric began to emerge. Books, manuscripts, ideas, texts on law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. Knowledge became currency. At its height, Timbuktu is believed to have housed tens of thousands of students. Libraries expanded, holding hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Collections were not just institutional. They were personal. Families preserved texts and passed them down across generations. Knowledge was not only produced, it was protected. And in the markets of Timbuktu, something remarkable happened. Books became more valuable than gold. This was not symbolic. It was functional, because knowledge had become the foundation of the system. This represents a complete inversion of economic logic. In a world where Mali controlled gold, its most important city began to prioritize something else entirely. Understanding, insight, intellectual capacity. This is where Musa's transformation becomes clear. He was no longer operating within the traditional model of power. He was redefining it. Most rulers build visible structures, armies, palaces, territories, but the most enduring forms of power are invisible. Ideas, systems of thought, intellectual traditions. Musa invested in those. He elevated scholars, not as supporting figures, but as central contributors to the empire's development. He created conditions where learning was respected, where teaching was valued, where intellectual pursuit became part of the cultural fabric. And as this system developed, something rare emerged. An intellectual network, not dependent on a single institution, not vulnerable to the fall of a single leader, but sustained by a community. Scholars trained students. Students became scholars. Knowledge circulated, adapted, expanded. This is what gave Timbuktu resilience. Because while political systems can collapse, intellectual systems, when properly embedded, can endure. Musa understood this. He was not building for immediate return. He was building for continuity. This requires a different kind of thinking, because the results are not immediate. A library does not transform a society overnight. A school does not create a generation instantly. But over time, quietly, steadily, they reshape how people think. And when you change how people think, you change everything. Governance, trade, culture, identity. Musa was not just investing in infrastructure. He was investing in cognition. At the same time that Timbuktu was rising, other parts of the world were still navigating instability. Systems of learning existed elsewhere, but access was limited. Structures were rigid, and knowledge was often controlled. In Timbuktu, something different was taking shape. a system where intellectual pursuit was encouraged, where debate was possible, where knowledge moved freely. This is what made it powerful. And yet, in modern narratives, this story is often reduced, simplified, or overlooked entirely. But its impact was real. Because Musa had achieved something rare, he had taken wealth and redirected it. From accumulation to creation, from visibility to continuity. And in doing so, he laid the foundation for a legacy that would extend far beyond his lifetime. Power is often misunderstood. It is usually seen as something external measured in resources, territory, and visibility. Something that can be displayed, demonstrated, and proved. But the most enduring forms of power are not always visible. They are internal. They shape decisions before actions are taken. They define purpose before outcomes are pursued. For Mansa Musa, power was not just something he held. It was something he understood. And that understanding was shaped by belief. Musa was a Muslim, but to describe that as a simple detail would be to miss its significance. Because in his world, faith was not separate from leadership. It was integrated into it. It informed decisions, defined responsibilities, established boundaries. At the center of this framework was a principle that redefined the meaning of wealth. Wealth was not ownership. It was trust. A responsibility placed in the hands of an individual, not for personal accumulation alone, but for purposeful use. This idea changes everything, because when wealth is seen as ownership, the objective becomes preservation, growth, accumulation. But when wealth is seen as responsibility, the objective shifts. It becomes distribution, impact, stewardship. This is where Musa's actions begin to make sense, not as isolated events, but as expressions of a larger philosophy. His generosity in Cairo was not random. It was aligned with belief. Within Islamic teaching, there is a concept known as zakat, a form of obligatory giving, where a portion of wealth is redistributed to those in need. It is not optional. It is not symbolic. It is structural. A mechanism designed to prevent extreme concentration and to ensure circulation within society. For Musa, this was not theory. It was practice. His wealth carried obligation, and he acted on it. But what distinguishes Musa is not that he gave. It is how he evolved in his giving. Because after Cairo, something changed. He had seen the unintended consequences of unstructured distribution. He had witnessed how scale could disrupt balance, and he adjusted. This is where leadership becomes visible, not in the initial action, but in the response to its consequences. Musa did not abandon generosity. He refined it. He shifted from immediate giving to intentional investment, from short-term impact to long-term structure. This is the difference between charity and strategy. Both address needs, but only one builds systems that sustain change. Musa began to channel wealth into institutions, into knowledge, into environments where value could be created continuously, rather than distributed once. This reflects a deeper understanding of power. Because power, at its highest level, is not about control. It is about direction. The ability to guide resources toward outcomes that extend beyond the present moment. This requires restraint, because when you have the capacity to act immediately, choosing not to, choosing instead to build, is a different kind of strength. It is quieter, less visible, but more enduring. Musa's leadership reflects this. He did not separate faith from governance. He integrated them. His decisions were not purely economic. They were not purely political. They were guided by a framework that connected belief to action. And this produced something rare: consistency. Because when actions are grounded in a clear philosophy, they align, they reinforce each other, They create coherence. Musa's investment in Timbuktu was not separate from his generosity in Cairo. It was a continuation, a refinement, an evolution from giving resources to create systems that generate resources, from addressing immediate need to shape future capacity. This is where his story moves beyond history and becomes insight, because the tension he navigated still exists. The question of what wealth is for. Is it to be accumulated, displayed, distributed, or transformed? There is no single answer, but Musa's approach offers a perspective. Wealth can command attention. It can create visibility. It can establish presence. But attention is temporary. Visibility fades. Presence shifts. What endures is what is built. What is embedded into systems? What continues to operate when the individual is no longer present? This is the distinction between influence and legacy. Influence is immediate. It creates a reaction. Legacy is sustained. It shapes direction. Musa chose legacy, and that choice required a different relationship with power, not one defined by dominance, but by responsibility. Not one focused on accumulation, but on application. And this is where his story becomes more than historical narrative. It becomes a reflection. Because in every era, individuals and institutions accumulate wealth. And in every era, the same question emerges. What should be done with it? Musa's answer was not perfect. No system is. No approach is without consequence. But it was intentional, and intention matters because it determines direction, and direction determines outcome. Yet, despite the scale of his wealth, despite the transformation he initiated, despite the systems he built, there is something unexpected about Mansa Musa. He is not widely remembered, not in the way one might expect. His name does not dominate global narratives. His story is not universally taught. And that raises another question. Not about wealth, not about power, but about memory. How does a figure of such magnitude become distant, not erased, but overlooked? The answer lies not in what Musa did, but in how history is told, and who tells it. There is a difference between being forgotten and being overlooked. For Mansa Musa, the issue was never absence. It was attention, because there was a time when his presence was not only recognized, but also documented. In 1375, more than a decade after his reign, European cartographers produced one of the most detailed maps of the known world at the time, the Catalan Atlas. On that map, in West Africa, sits a figure, a king, holding a piece of gold. He is not hidden. He is not minimized. He is not treated as a minor detail. He is central. That figure represents Mansa Musa. To the mapmakers, he was not an obscure ruler. He was a symbol, a representation of wealth, influence, and power so significant that it demanded inclusion in a visual record of the world. This matters because it shows that Musa was known, not just within his own region, but across continents. His story had traveled. His impact had been observed. His existence had been acknowledged. And yet, over time, something changed. Not in what he did, but in how he was remembered. Because history is not only a record of events, it is a narrative. And narratives are shaped. They are influenced by perspective, by power, by priority. What is included matters, but what is excluded matters just as much. As global narratives began to center around Europe, its expansion, its conflicts, its transformations, other stories began to receive less attention. Not because they lacked significance, but because they existed outside the dominant frame. Africa, in many of these narratives, became simplified, reduced, often misrepresented. Complex systems were overlooked. Intellectual traditions were minimized, and figures like Musa, Ayub Shelsa, became less visible. This is how erasure often works, not through deliberate removal, but through gradual neglect. A shift in focus, a narrowing of perspective, until what was once central becomes peripheral, and what was once widely known becomes unfamiliar. Musa's story did not disappear. It remained in manuscripts, in oral histories, in records preserved across regions, but it did not occupy the same space in mainstream narratives. And over time, that absence shaped perception. Because what is not taught is often assumed not to exist. What is not emphasized is often assumed not to matter. This is why rediscovery feels like revelation. Not because the subject is new, but because of the attention. In recent years, Musa's name has begun to re-emerge, appearing in discussions about wealth, referenced in analyses of historical economies, recognized in broader conversations about Africa's past. But even this re-emergence is often limited, focused on a single aspect: his wealth, reduced to numbers, to comparisons, to rankings. And while his wealth is remarkable, it is not the entirety of his story. Because to understand Musa only as the richest man who ever lived is to miss what made him significant. His influence was not just economic, it was intellectual, structural, philosophical. He did not just accumulate wealth, he redirected it. He did not just display power, he reshaped it. And that is harder to quantify, harder to summarize, harder to fit into simplified narratives. But it is essential, because it changes how we understand history. It expands it, challenges assumptions, introduces complexity. And complexity requires attention. It requires effort. It requires a willingness to look beyond familiar frameworks. Musa's story invites that, not as a correction alone, but as an expansion. A reminder that history is broader than the narratives we inherit. That influence exists in multiple forms. That power has taken different shapes across time and place. And that understanding requires perspective. Because when a figure like Mansa Musa becomes overlooked, something is lost. Not just a name, but a set of ideas. A model of leadership. An example of how wealth can be used differently. Rediscovering Musa is not about filling a gap. It is about restoring balance. Reintroducing a story that complicates assumptions, that expands understanding, that challenges simplicity, because the past is not a single narrative, it is a collection of perspectives. And when one perspective dominates, others fade, until they are brought back into view. Musa's story has returned to view, but how it is understood still depends on how it is told, and what we choose to focus on. Because there is one final question left. Not about how much he had, not about what he gave, not even about what he built, but about what remains. What endures after wealth is gone, after power shifts, after attention moves on. What is left is legacy. What remains after wealth is gone? It is a question that rarely receives attention, because wealth in its visible form dominates perception. It captures focus. It defines status. It shapes how individuals and societies are measured. Numbers, rankings, valuations. These are the metrics we use. But they are temporary. They shift. They rise and fall. They respond to forces that are constantly changing. What feels permanent often isn't. Mansa Musa's story challenges this perspective. Because while his wealth was extraordinary, it is not what endures. No account exists that can fully capture it. No modern valuation can accurately translate it. No comparison can fully contain it. His wealth was too large for precise measurement. But what matters is not how much he had. It is what he did with it. Because wealth, at its core, is potential. It can be accumulated, stored, protected. But until it is directed, it remains inactive. Musa directed it. At first, through distribution. His journey to Mecca demonstrated what wealth looks like when it is released into the world without constraint. It created visibility, impact, disruption. It showed how power can be expressed immediately. But it also revealed the limits of that approach, because immediate impact does not always translate into lasting change. It can alter conditions, but it does not always transform them. And transformation was what Musa ultimately pursued. When he returned to Mali, he shifted. From distribution to design, from giving resources to building systems. This is where his legacy takes shape, because systems outlast individuals. They continue to operate, they adapt, they influence outcomes across time. Musa's investment in Timbuktu represents this shift. He did not simply enhance an existing city. He redefined its purpose. He created an environment where knowledge could develop, circulate, and expand. An intellectual ecosystem, one that did not depend on a single moment. Because when you build something that outlasts you, your influence extends beyond your lifetime. It becomes part of a larger system, a larger narrative, a larger continuity. This is legacy, not memory, not recognition, but impact that persists. And yet, legacy is often misunderstood. It is often associated with visibility, with monuments, with recognition. But true legacy does not always require attention. It requires continuity, the ability to endure, to remain relevant, to continue shaping outcomes, even when the original source is no longer present. Musa's legacy exists in this form, not just in the stories told about him, but in the systems he helped create, in the intellectual traditions that developed, in the idea that wealth can be used differently, that it can be redirected, reimagined, reapplied. This is where his story connects to the present, because the question he faced still exists. What is wealth for? In a world where individuals and institutions control vast resources, the tension remains between accumulation and application, between visibility and substance, between short-term impact and long-term design. There is no single answer, but Musa's approach offers a perspective. Wealth can command attention, but attention fades. Wealth can create influence, but influence shifts. What endures is what is built, what is embedded into systems, what continues to operate beyond the individual. This is the difference between having wealth and transforming it. Mansa Musa did not just possess wealth. He engaged with it. He tested its limits. He experienced its consequences. And ultimately, he redirected it. From gold to knowledge, from immediate impact to lasting structure, from presence to legacy. And that is what remains, not the numbers, not the rankings, but the transformation. Because in the end, wealth is not defined by how much is held, but by what it becomes. Say his name, Mansa Musa.